Giant Brian, the world's most conniving criminal, best known for escaping prisons of all shapes and sizes. He'd escape prisons in the desert, prisons out at sea, prisons on wheels, prisons on wings, and even a prison in space. But in the most unforeseen of twists, this dangerous convict was now the planet's only hope, as half of the entire world suffered under a new military dictatorship, the People's Republic of Tesco. Despite its name, this republic was not for the people at all. Instead, it served one person and one person only. The brainwashed masses worshipped a man named the Glorious Leader, but he was merely a puppet. Behind the scenes, a much more sinister dictator ruled from the shadows, orchestrating evil whilst posing as no more than an innocent policewoman. Giant Brian's arch nemesis, Officer. Oh crumbs, Brian knew he shouldn't have stolen those Freddo frogs from Tesco all that time ago, but there was no way of predicting it would eventually cause the military occupation of half of the Earth. Plus, he was quite literally out of orbit for most of it, so he decided to cut himself some slack. Best not to beat yourself up over these things. That aside, Brian was once again stuck in jail, and the idea of letting Officer get away with all this made his very blood boil. That was it. He was going to stop this rotten revolution in the only way he knew how. Brian was going to escape. Instead of finding an escape route himself though, Brian decided to enroll on the official Tesco compound tour. This way he could search for places to break out, whilst also learning about the prison's fascinating history. For example, this prison canteen used to serve bags of quavers, until one day their entire quaver stock mysteriously disappeared. Interesting. Quavers were Brian's favourite flavour of crisps. And the intrigue didn't stop there. This two-seater Apache helicopter wasn't the 1962 model, but in fact the newer, more streamlined 1967 model. Hang on, there was a helicopter here? Well, Giant Brian's escape plans had just got a whole load easier. With a military-grade helicopter on his side, preventing Officer's evil schemes would be no problem. And, in high spirits, Brian launched into action. His first move was to get himself some climbing gear, but to do this he would need some help. So Brian enlisted the services of his fellow inmate, No Face. Brian was usually a solo escape artist, but this situation was perfect, as nobody would remember a man with no face, so Brian could still claim all of the credit. With No Face's help, he was able to sneak past a large metal door into the storage room behind, in which was a chest containing a crowbar. Just what he was searching for. But just as soon as he retrieved this item, No Face disappeared in a puff of smoke. What a mysterious guy. Oh well, he had served his purpose, and all Brian needed now was a rope. After performing several favours for other prisoners, such as delivering talcum powder for Salmon Face or fetching a lump of sugar for Pastrami Pam, he was able to buy one from the local dealer. And with this, he crafted his very own grappling hook. It was time to grapple, and grapple hard. Sprinting past all of the dumb schmucks at roll call, Brian found himself the perfect location, then climbing the walls using his incredible upper body strength. His new grappling hook was working a charm. He would arrive at that helicopter in no time, but oh bollocks. This was just typical. As usual, his destination was blocked off by a red staff door. Brian tried to find his way around this predicament, but having clambered too high up, he was spotted by a prison sniper, then resulting in a long and thrilling chase scene involving him and about 20 million officers. Of course, rumour had it Brian was so fast he could walk on water, and despite the fact this was a rumour he made up during his Messiah complex phase, he was able to outrun his captors, then waiting out the heat in a filing cabinet. Well, as was tradition at this point, Brian was going to need to acquire a red key. Thankfully, with his great wealth of prison experience, he knew exactly where to find one. Officer, your days are numbered. Wait, what? But Officer always had the red key. Brian had just taken out the chief of police for no reason at all. And here comes backup. You'll never take me alive, Officer Borlake, shouted Brian. But hold up, happy days! There it was, the red key! Hurrying back to his room, Brian crafted a duplicate as quickly as possible. Then, with all his items in check, he set off on escape attempt number 2. scaling the walls with his hook once more. This time Brian slipped straight through the red door and up the stairs to the helipad. Here we go. It was time to cause some chaos. But then Brian remembered something very important they had told him on his prison tour. This was a 2-person helicopter. He couldn't fly this thing on his own. If only No-Face hadn't performed ninjutsu and disappeared into a puff of smoke. Escape postponed again. He was gonna have to find a new accomplice. And so, sneaking back downstairs, Brian infiltrated the surveillance room and began to study the security footage in the hopes he could find a worthy sidekick. As he sat there, however, his attention was drawn to one screen in particular. An old dusty monitor which read, "Special Case Study, detained in maximum security at Fort Tundra." Change of plans then. It seemed Brian would be transferring prisons. Fort Tundra, here we come. Before he could head north, however, he needed to find a way to ditch this totalitarian dump. Thankfully, Brian had a genius idea, so he ran headfirst into an electric fence, his hope being that he was so badly injured they would have to take him out of prison in an emergency ambulance. Unfortunately, thanks to an accident working at a previous job in a Wellington boot factory, Brian's body was made of 30% rubber, just enough for him to survive with no lasting damage. It seemed he would have to go even more extreme. Brian was going to have to die. Making himself a fake nurse's uniform and sneaking into the medical room, he stole some blocks of ice. The theory being he could create a device that would make him so cold it slowed his pulse to the point where he appeared to be dead. This got the doctor's attention, and before he knew it, they were dumping him into a body bag and shipping him, unknowingly, to freedom. But in the midst of this, it dawned on Brian that if he kept the act up for too long, he might end up being buried alive. So, making a rather sudden and extraordinary recovery, he jumped out the back of the ambulance and escaped before the doctors had time to realise he wasn't quite the medical miracle they had just witnessed. To remain undetected on his extensive journey north, Brian decided to swim the majority of the way, resulting in a minor case of hypothermia, but nothing Brian couldn't handle, and oh look who's decided to follow along. Of course No-Face turns up now that we don't need him anymore. Trudging his way through the snowy forests, all that remained was to break back into prison. This felt wrong, but Brian would just have to suck it up. And, using his infamous diggy hole method, getting inside of Fort Tundra was a piece of cake. But Brian had a sneaking suspicion this tunnel would only work once, for this prison was nothing to be sniffed at. The extreme Siberian conditions chilled inmates and officers alike to their very core. In spite of this, Brian knew it would all be worth it when he found out just who this special case study was. Oh, hang on. Oh no. No. It was Don Krieg again. Don had been Brian's partner in crime during 2 of his previous escapes. However, Brian had to leave Don in space as he was, to put it kindly, completely inept. As it turned out, Don had managed to return from space by asking for a snow cone as his death row final meal. Hence he had been re-sanctioned here. Oh dear, death row? Sure, Brian found Don's habit of walking into walls infuriating, but even he didn't want to see his good friend kick the bucket. So, together they sat down at the breakfast table and devised an ingenious plan. First, Brian would beat up 3 guards all on his own, then making 2 copies of the red key, whilst Don would sit here and stay out of trouble. Then, Brian would scavenge for materials and fashion a pickaxe using nothing but wood and duct tape, whilst Don would sit here and stay out of trouble. Finally, the 2 of them would make their way to the far east of the compound, where they would sneak past a warehouse door, mine through the frozen walls, and steal the off-road jeep that sat idle on the other side. With Brian having failed his driving theory test a record 457 times, Don Krieg insisted on driving. This was a bad idea. But after a minor collision, they set off back towards the Tesco compound, ready and raring for a grand showdown. Upon reaching the site, Brian and Don snuck past the guards, making no more sound than a passing breeze. Well, that is until Brian decided to do some showboating and began to breakdance in the middle of the road. With Officer watching on, this was a declaration of war. She had haunted the lives of Brian and so many others for too long. With every body pop, every flourishing spin, he made his point heard. No matter how many strings she pulled behind the scenes, Giant Brian refused to be tied down. They were back inside, and, provoking a little round 2 from Officer Borlake, Brian stole what he hoped would be the last red key he would ever need. The only issue now was that Brian didn't know how to fly a helicopter, and having seen Don drive a car, well, best not to take the risk. Therefore, they would have to find some way to coax one of the guards into flying it for them, and to achieve this, they would need Anne Gunn. Oh, there she was, just the woman they were searching for. Anne was an old companion of Brian's. She used to work as a driving theory instructor, but those days were behind her, and she now held down a job as a weaponsmith. Combining some wax, a piece of soap and a dinner tray, she then painted it with a jar of ink, and a fake gun was created. Brian felt safer using a fake gun, as it meant the documentary he was planning to make afterwards wouldn't get demonetized. With that, everything was in place. The time was now. Side by side, Brian and Don grappled up the walls of the compound, back onto the roof, and then through the red door and up the stairs to the helipad on the top floor. Just in time, they hurled themselves inside the helicopter, using the plastic gun to force the pilot to take off. Despite her henchman's pathetic struggles, all Officer could do was stare upwards in awe as her master plan went up in smoke. Brian and Don were going to liberate everyone, and the collective cheers of prisoners all across the People's Republic of Tesco were easily loud enough to reach them high up in the sky. Brian thought back. He had come such a long way since digging through walls with plastic spoons in Center Perks. Freedom, this time true freedom, beckoned. But first, more important matters. "Take us to the nearest corner shop," shouted Brian. "I'm going to steal some Freddo frogs."